Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, where we uncover the most perplexing mysteries that have slipped through the cracks of recorded history. I'm your host, and today we're venturing into a tale so bizarre, so utterly impossible, that even seasoned researchers struggle to categorize it. This is the story of Millfield, a town that existed outside the natural flow of time itself. Before we begin, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about the nature of reality. The events I'm about to describe were documented by multiple witnesses investigated by federal authorities, and yet somehow they remain largely unknown to the outside world. So settle in, check your doors, and prepare yourself for one of the most unsettling chronicles we've ever shared on this channel. The first reports of something unusual in Millfield, Colorado, began filtering into government offices in the spring of 1962. Located in a remote valley roughly 40 miles northeast of Denver, Millfield was the kind of place that barely registered on most maps. Population 847, founded in 1889 as a mining settlement, it had evolved into a quiet farming community where 3 generations of the same families had lived and worked the same land for decades. What made these initial reports so disturbing wasn't their content, but their source. They came from the United States Geological Survey, specifically from a team conducting routine atmospheric readings across the Colorado Plains. Dr. Margaret Chen, the lead researcher, had been tracking weather patterns and atmospheric anomalies as part of a broader climate study. Her team had been taking measurements from the same locations for over 18 months, establishing baseline data that would inform agricultural policies for the region. On March 15, 1962, Dr. Yale Chen's instruments detected something that should have been impossible. The atmospheric readings from the Millfield Valley were identical to those taken on the same date the previous year. Not similar, identical. Every measurement, every data point, every atmospheric pressure reading matched with mathematical precision. At first, Dr. Chen assumed equipment malfunction. She ordered new instruments, recalibrated her existing ones, and sent a second team to verify the readings. The results were the same. Somehow, the atmospheric conditions in Millfield had remained absolutely unchanged for exactly 1 year. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, wind patterns, even the chemical composition of the air, all frozen in a state of perfect repetition. Dr. Chen's report, filed with the Department of Agriculture and later classified by the Department of Defense, would be the first official documentation of what scientists would eventually call the Millfield anomaly. But the atmospheric readings were just the beginning. Within weeks of Dr. Chen's initial report, other irregularities began to surface. The Regional Weather Service noted that Millfield consistently reported identical weather conditions on corresponding dates from the previous year. Rain fell at exactly the same times in precisely the same amounts. Snowfall patterns matched with uncanny accuracy. Even cloud formations appeared to repeat in perfect synchronization. Local authorities initially dismissed these reports as clerical errors or equipment problems. Sheriff Daniel Morrison, who had served the county for nearly 2 decades, was skeptical when federal investigators first approached him about the so-called anomalies. These government types come through here every few years with their fancy equipment and their theories, he told his deputy. Usually they're looking for uranium or oil or some such nonsense. Never amounts to much. Morrison's attitude changed dramatically after his first visit to Millfield on April 12, 1962. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately lead to one of the most classified investigations in modern American history. According to Morrison's official report filed with the Colorado State Police and immediately seized by federal agents, the town of Millfield was operating on a completely different temporal schedule than the rest of the world. The sheriff's account reads like something from a fever dream. He described arriving in Millfield at approximately 10:30 a.m. on what was, by all external calendars, a Thursday in April. The town appeared normal at first glance. People went about their daily routines, shops were open, children played in the streets. But as Morrison observed more closely, he began to notice disturbing patterns. Every person in Millfield was performing the exact same actions they had performed on the same day the previous year. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings was hanging laundry on her clothesline, the same blue dress and white sheets in the same order. Tom Bradley was repairing the same section of fence behind his hardware store, using the same tools, making the same repairs. Even the children were playing the same games in the same locations, their laughter echoing at precisely the same moments. Morrison approached several residents, attempting to engage them in conversation. Their responses were polite but strangely hollow, as if they were reciting lines from a script they had memorized perfectly. When he asked about current events, they referenced news from exactly 1 year prior. When he inquired about the date, they consistently gave him the date from 1961, not 1962. Most unsettling of all was Morrison's encounter with the town's postmaster, Harold Vance. Vance was sorting mail when Morrison entered the post office, and the sheriff noticed that every piece of mail was dated from the previous year. When Morrison pointed this out, Vance looked at him with genuine confusion. "What do you mean last year?" Vance asked. "This mail just came in this morning. Look, here's today's date stamp." He held up a letter clearly marked April 12, 1961. Morrison left Millfield in a state of profound disorientation. His drive back to the county seat took exactly the same amount of time as always. His radio picked up current broadcasts, and his watch showed the correct time and date. But the memory of those repeated actions, those recycled conversations, those people living the same day over and over again remained vivid and disturbing. The sheriff's report triggered an immediate response from federal authorities. Within 48 hours, teams from the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, and a then-classified division of the Department of Energy had descended upon the small Colorado Valley. What they found there would challenge the fundamental assumptions of modern science and lead to one of the most extensive cover-up operations in American history. Dr. Robert Steinberg, a theoretical physicist from the University of Chicago, was among the first scientists to study the Millfield anomaly directly. His initial assessment, contained in a report that remained classified for over 50 years, described the phenomenon as a localized temporal displacement of unprecedented magnitude and unknown origin. In layman's terms, the town of Millfield had somehow become unstuck from the normal flow of time. Steinberg's team established a research station on the outskirts of Millfield and began conducting round-the-clock observations. They confirmed Sheriff Morrison's initial findings and documented additional anomalies that defied explanation. Clocks within the town limits ran backward for exactly 1 year, then reset to the correct time, only to begin the backward progression again. Calendars showed dates from 1961 regardless of when they were observed. Even more disturbing, the residents appeared to be aging in reverse, becoming progressively younger as the year progressed, only to return to their original ages at the end of the cycle. The implications were staggering. If time could be manipulated on this scale, if an entire community could be trapped in a temporal loop, then everything scientists thought they knew about the nature of reality was fundamentally flawed. The potential applications for such technology were limitless, as were the dangers. In the wrong hands, the ability to control time could reshape the balance of power on a global scale. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Millfield anomaly wasn't the temporal displacement itself, but the question of how it had begun. Someone or something had created this impossible situation, and as federal investigators would soon discover, the answer to that question lay buried in the town's forgotten past, in events that had occurred decades before anyone had ever heard of temporal anomalies or time loops. What they found in Millfield's history would prove that some secrets are too dangerous to remain hidden, and that the boundaries between science and the supernatural are far more fragile than anyone had ever imagined. The investigation into Millfield's past began with a routine examination of county records and historical documents. What researchers discovered was a pattern of unexplained events stretching back nearly a century, a trail of breadcrumbs that led to one of the most disturbing experiments in American history. In 1889, when Millfield was first established, the town had attracted an unusual mix of residents. While most mining settlements drew prospectors and laborers seeking quick fortunes, Millfield had also become home to a small but significant population of academics and scientists. Professor Ezra Whitmore, a physicist from Harvard University, had purchased substantial land in the valley and established what he called the Western Institute for Temporal Studies. Dr. Steinberg's team found references to Whitmore's work scattered throughout academic journals from the 1890s. The professor had been fascinated by the concept of time as a physical dimension, decades before Einstein's theories would make such ideas mainstream. His papers, published in obscure scientific periodicals, described experiments with what he called chronological manipulation, attempts to slow, accelerate, or even reverse the flow of time within controlled environments. Most of the academic community dismissed Whitmore's theories as the ravings of an eccentric. But the professor had attracted a small group of devoted followers, scientists and philosophers who believed that time was not the immutable constant that conventional wisdom suggested. Together they had established the Western Institute as a laboratory for pursuing what they called the Great Work, an ambitious attempt to prove that time itself could be conquered. The first documented anomaly in Millfield occurred on October 31, 1912. According to newspaper accounts from neighboring towns, residents reported that the sun had set twice on that date, once at the normal time and again several hours later. Local authorities attributed the reports to mass hallucination or atmospheric disturbances, but Dr. Steinberg's team found meteorological records that confirmed the impossible double sunset. Over the following decades, strange occurrences became increasingly common in Millfield. Residents aged at different rates, some appearing to grow younger while others aged rapidly. Crops matured out of season or failed to grow at all. Children born in the town sometimes displayed unusual characteristics, developing at accelerated rates or remaining physically unchanged for years at a time. The most detailed account of these early anomalies came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a physician who had moved to Millfield in 1923 to establish a medical practice. Her journal, discovered in the basement of the abandoned clinic, documented decades of impossible medical cases. Patients who recovered from terminal illnesses overnight, wounds that healed backward, leaving scars that gradually faded until the skin was unmarked, and most disturbing of all, individuals who appeared to be living their lives in reverse chronological order. Dr. Mitchell's entries became increasingly frantic as the years progressed. She described patients who remembered events that had not yet occurred, who spoke of conversations that would take place in the future, and who seemed to be experiencing their lives in a completely different sequence than the rest of the world. By 1940, her final entry read simply, "The experiment has succeeded beyond our wildest dreams and our worst nightmares. God help us all." The connection between these historical anomalies and the events of 1962 became clear when investigators discovered Professor Whitmore's private laboratory hidden beneath the ruins of the Western Institute. The underground complex had been sealed for decades, but federal agents managed to break through the reinforced doors to find a perfectly preserved time capsule of early 20th century science. The laboratory contained equipment that seemed decades ahead of its time. Machines that combined elements of physics, chemistry, and what could only be described as occult symbolism. At the center of the complex stood a massive device that Whitmore had called the Kronos Engine, a towering construction of copper coils, crystalline components, and mechanical clockwork that defied easy categorization. Dr. Steinberg's analysis of the device revealed technology that shouldn't have existed in 1912. The professor had somehow developed methods for manipulating temporal fields, creating localized distortions in the fabric of time itself. His notebooks, written in a mixture of scientific notation and cryptic symbols, described successful experiments in temporal displacement dating back to the early 1900s. But the most chilling discovery was Whitmore's final experiment, conducted on March 15, 1961. Exactly 1 year before Dr. Chen's team had first detected the atmospheric anomalies. According to his notes, the professor had achieved what he called temporal stabilization, locking the town of Millfield into a perfect loop of repeating time. The residents would live the same year over and over again, their lives cycling through the same events, the same conversations, the same experiences in perpetual repetition. Whitmore's motivation for this ultimate experiment remained unclear. Some of his writings suggested he viewed it as a form of immortality, a way to preserve human life indefinitely by preventing the passage of time. Other entries hinted at darker purposes, references to punishment and eternal imprisonment, as if the time loop was meant to trap the residents in a kind of temporal purgatory. The professor himself had vanished shortly after activating the Kronos engine. His final journal entry, dated March 16, 1961, read, "The mechanism is engaged. The loop is established. I go now to observe the results from outside the affected area. If this record is ever found, know that I have achieved what no man has achieved before. I have conquered time itself. But Whitmore's victory came at a terrible cost. The 847 residents of Millfield had become unwitting prisoners in their own lives, trapped in an endless cycle of repetition. They retained no memory of the previous loops, no awareness that they were living the same experiences over and over again. To them, each day was new, each conversation fresh, each experience happening for the first time. The federal investigation team faced an unprecedented dilemma. They had discovered evidence of the most significant scientific breakthrough in human history. But that breakthrough had been achieved through what amounted to the imprisonment of nearly 1,000 people. The ethical implications were staggering, as were the potential consequences of either revealing or concealing the truth. Dr. Steinberg's team attempted to communicate with the trapped residents, but their efforts proved largely futile. The people of Millfield could not comprehend their situation, could not retain information about the outside world, and could not break free from the patterns that had been established by the temporal loop. They were living ghosts, going through the motions of life without truly living. As the investigation continued, federal authorities began to realize that the Millfield anomaly represented both an incredible opportunity and an existential threat. If Professor Whitmore's technology could be understood and replicated, it could revolutionize everything from military strategy to space exploration. But it could also be weaponized in ways that would make conventional warfare obsolete. The decision was made at the highest levels of government to classify the entire Millfield situation under the most restrictive security protocols. The town was quietly evacuated, its residents relocated to various facilities where they could be monitored and studied. The official story was a gas leak that had made the area uninhabitable, a cover story that explained the sudden abandonment of an entire community. But the Kronos engine continued to operate, its temporal field still active even without residents to affect. The empty town of Millfield remained locked in its endless loop, cycling through the same year over and over again like a broken record stuck on a single song. And somewhere in that temporal prison, the ghost of Professor Whitmore's ambition continued to haunt the very fabric of reality itself. The relocation of Millfield's residents proved to be a logistical nightmare that would consume federal resources for decades. These weren't ordinary evacuees who could be processed through standard government channels. These were individuals whose very existence challenged the fundamental laws of physics. People who had been living the same year in perpetual repetition for over a decade. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, a psychiatrist specializing in dissociative disorders, was brought in to assess the psychological state of the evacuated residents. Her preliminary findings were both fascinating and deeply troubling. The subjects displayed no awareness of their temporal imprisonment, no memory of previous loops, and no understanding of why they had been removed from their homes. To them, it was simply April 13th, 1961, the day after their last remembered experience in Millfield. What made the situation even more complex was the physical evidence of their temporal displacement. Medical examinations revealed that the residents had not aged normally during their time in the loop. Some appeared younger than their chronological age should have indicated, while others showed signs of accelerated aging in specific areas of their bodies. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, for example, had the hands of an elderly woman but the face of someone decades younger, as if different parts of her body had been aging at different rates. The children presented the most disturbing cases. 7-year-old Tommy Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, had been living in Millfield during the activation of the temporal loop. When evacuated, he appeared to be the same age as when the loop began. But psychological testing revealed that he possessed knowledge and memories that spanned multiple repetitions of the same year. He could describe conversations that had occurred dozens of times, predict the exact words his teachers would use, and knew the outcome of every game he had played with his friends. Dr. Harmon's interviews with Tommy revealed a mind that had been fractured by temporal repetition. The boy would start sentences in the middle as if continuing conversations from previous loops. He would ask about events that had happened years ago as if they were yesterday, and he would sometimes respond to questions before they were asked, drawing from his memory of identical interactions from previous cycles. The adult residents displayed their own forms of temporal displacement. Robert Jennings, the town's blacksmith, continued to perform his work with mechanical precision, but he had no memory of learning his trade. His hands knew exactly what to do, his muscle memory was perfect, but he couldn't explain how he had acquired his skills. When asked about his past, he would recite the same biographical details he had shared countless times during the loop. But the words came out like a memorized script rather than genuine recollection. Perhaps most unsettling was the case of Father Michael O'Brien, the town's Catholic priest. During his time in the loop, he had delivered the same sermon every Sunday for over a decade, offered the same prayers, provided the same spiritual guidance to his parishioners. When evacuated, he retained his theological knowledge and his faith, but he had no memory of his ordination, no recollection of his seminary training, and no understanding of how he had come to serve the people of Millfield. The federal facilities where the residents were housed became laboratories for studying temporal displacement in human subjects. Dr. Steinberg's team worked closely with medical professionals to understand the long-term effects of chronological manipulation. They discovered that the residents' cellular structure had been fundamentally altered by their experience in the loop. Their DNA showed signs of temporal stress, patterns that shouldn't have been possible under normal circumstances. Blood samples revealed that the residents were aging at different rates in different parts of their bodies. Some organs appeared to be functioning normally, while others showed signs of either accelerated deterioration or supernatural preservation. The implications were staggering. If temporal manipulation could affect biological processes so dramatically, it suggested that time itself was far more malleable than anyone had previously imagined. Meanwhile, back in the abandoned town of Millfield, the Kronos engine continued its relentless operation. Remote monitoring equipment installed by federal agents confirmed that the temporal field remained active, cycling through the same year-long pattern with mathematical precision. The empty streets filled with phantom echoes of the residents who had once lived there, their actions repeating in invisible loops that could only be detected by specialized instruments. Dr. Steinberg made several attempts to enter the affected area and study the temporal field directly, but each expedition ended in failure. Anyone who crossed the boundary into Millfield became trapped in the loop, forced to repeat the same actions over and over again until they could be extracted by remote-controlled equipment. The few researchers who experienced the loop firsthand reported a complete loss of free will, as if their consciousness had been overridden by the temporal pattern. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators realized that the loop wasn't perfectly stable. Small variations began to appear in the repeated cycle, subtle changes that suggested the temporal field was slowly degrading. Dr. Steinberg's calculations indicated that the Kronos engine was operating beyond its design parameters, drawing energy from unknown sources to maintain the impossible temporal displacement. As the months passed, federal authorities began to detect anomalies spreading beyond Millfield's borders. Neighboring towns reported strange occurrences, temporal hiccups that seemed to ripple outward from the abandoned valley. Clocks would occasionally run backward for brief periods. People would experience moments of déjà vu so intense they became disorienting, and some residents reported brief glimpses of events that had already occurred. The situation reached a crisis point when Dr. Steinberg's team discovered that the temporal field was beginning to interact with the Earth's magnetic field. The planet's rotation was creating a drag effect on the localized time loop, causing stress fractures in the fabric of reality itself. If left unchecked, these fractures could potentially expand, creating larger temporal anomalies that might affect entire regions or even continents. The implications were terrifying. The technology that Professor Whitmore had developed in his underground laboratory was not just affecting the residents of Millfield. It was threatening the stability of time itself. The loop had become a temporal cancer, growing stronger with each cycle and spreading its influence across an ever-widening area. Federal authorities faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to shut down the Kronos engine, but doing so might cause a catastrophic temporal collapse that could erase entire sections of history. Or they could allow the loop to continue, knowing that it was slowly poisoning the timeline and could eventually unravel the very fabric of reality. Dr. Steinberg advocated for immediate intervention, arguing that the risks of inaction far outweighed the potential consequences of shutting down the device. But other members of the research team disagreed, pointing out that they still didn't fully understand how the Kronos engine worked or what would happen if it was deactivated improperly. The debate raged for months while the temporal anomalies continued to spread. Reports came in from as far away as Kansas and Wyoming of temporal disturbances that seemed to be connected to the Millfield Loop. Time was literally running out, and the fate of not just the trapped residents but potentially the entire timeline hung in the balance. As federal authorities struggled with their decision, something unexpected happened in the abandoned town of Millfield. The empty streets began to fill with new figures, shadowy forms that moved through the repeating patterns of the original residents. These weren't the evacuated townspeople, but something else entirely, entities that seemed to be drawn to the temporal disturbance like moths to a flame. Dr. Steinberg's remote monitoring equipment detected these new presences, but couldn't identify what they were or where they had come from. They moved through the town with purpose, interacting with the phantom echoes of the original loop in ways that suggested they understood the nature of the temporal prison far better than any human researcher. The discovery of these entities added a new dimension to the crisis. The Millfield anomaly wasn't just a scientific accident or a rogue experiment gone wrong. It had become something much more dangerous, a breach in the natural order that was allowing things from outside normal reality to seep into our world. And as the shadows continued to gather in the empty streets of Millfield, federal authorities realized that their window for action was rapidly closing. The town that time forgot was about to become something far more sinister, a doorway to possibilities that no one was prepared to face. The decision to enter Millfield one final time was made on a cold morning in February 1963, nearly a year after the initial discovery of the temporal anomaly. Dr. Steinberg led a team of 12 specialists, each equipped with experimental temporal stabilization devices that might, in theory, protect them from the loop's influence. They had one objective: reach the Kronos engine and shut it down before the spreading anomalies tore holes in reality itself. What they found in Millfield defied every prediction their models had generated. The town wasn't empty anymore. The shadowy entities that had appeared on their monitoring equipment had taken physical form, inhabiting the repeating patterns of the original residents. They moved through the streets with the same mechanical precision as the evacuated townspeople, but their eyes held an intelligence that was distinctly inhuman. Dr. Steinberg's team made it 3 blocks into the town before the temporal field began to affect them. One by one, the researchers found themselves falling into the rhythm of the loop, their actions becoming predetermined, their thoughts aligning with the patterns established a decade earlier. Only Dr. Steinberg himself, protected by a more advanced stabilization device, retained enough free will to continue toward the underground laboratory. The descent into Professor Whitmore's hidden complex was like traveling through layers of distorted time. Each level down seemed to exist in a different temporal state, with some areas moving faster than others, some cycling through multiple loops simultaneously. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with chronological energy, and Dr. Steinberg's instruments detected temporal radiation levels that should have been instantly fatal. At the heart of the laboratory, the Kronos engine had evolved far beyond its original design. The machine had been growing, expanding its crystalline components and copper coils throughout the underground complex like some kind of temporal organism. It no longer resembled the device described in Whitmore's journals, but had become something organic and alive, feeding on the very fabric of time itself. Standing before the transformed engine was Professor Whitmore himself, or what remained of him. The man who had conquered time had paid the ultimate price for his ambition. His body existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously, flickering between past and future versions of himself. Sometimes he appeared as the young researcher who had first arrived in Millfield, sometimes as the elderly professor who had activated the loop, and sometimes as something else entirely, a being that existed outside the normal flow of time. "Dr. Steinberg," Whitmore spoke, his voice echoing from multiple timelines at once. "I've been expecting you, or perhaps I should say I've already met you, will meet you, am meeting you now. Time becomes rather fluid when you exist in all moments simultaneously." The professor's explanation of what had occurred was both brilliant and terrifying. The Chronos engine hadn't just created a temporal loop, it had opened a gateway to what he called the eternal present, a realm where all moments existed simultaneously. The shadowy entities that had invaded Millfield were refugees from collapsed timelines, realities that had been consumed by temporal anomalies similar to the one he had created. "You see," Whitmore continued, his form shifting between ages, "time isn't linear as we believed. It's a living system, and when you wound it as deeply as I have, it begins to bleed. Those creatures you've detected aren't invaders, they're antibodies. Reality is trying to heal itself, but the process will consume everything we know." Dr. Steinberg realized that shutting down the Chronos engine wouldn't solve the problem. The temporal wound had grown too large, too complex. The only way to stop the spreading anomalies was to cauterize the breach, to seal it from within. But doing so would require someone to remain behind, to sacrifice themselves to maintain the containment field. Professor Whitmore, existing in his fractured temporal state, was the only one who could perform the procedure. He had become part of the machine, his consciousness merged with the very fabric of the temporal field, but the process would require him to collapse all his timeline iterations into a single moment, effectively destroying himself to save reality. "It's fitting," Whitmore said, his voice becoming more coherent as he prepared for the final procedure. "I sought to conquer time, and in the end, time conquered me. But perhaps this is how it was always meant to be. Perhaps my entire existence was leading to this moment, this choice." The professor began the shutdown sequence, his multiple temporal forms converging into a single brilliant point of light. The Chronos engine screamed as it was forced to reverse its decade-long operation, the crystalline components shattering as the temporal field collapsed inward. Dr. Steinberg felt reality reassert itself around him, the loop finally breaking after years of repetition. But the cost was enormous. The implosion of the temporal field created a dead zone around Millfield, an area where time moved differently than the rest of the world. The town itself was erased from existence, not destroyed, but simply removed from the timeline, as if it had never been built. The valley where it once stood became a blank space on maps, a place that cartographers consistently overlooked without understanding why. The evacuated residents of Millfield faced their own tragic fate. Without the temporal field to sustain their altered existence, many began to age rapidly, their bodies catching up to their chronological time all at once. Some simply faded away, their connection to reality severed by the destruction of the loop. Others survived but remained forever changed, carrying within them fragments of temporal displacement that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Dr. Steinberg's official report, classified at the highest levels of government, concluded that the Millfield anomaly had been successfully contained, but at a cost that could never be fully calculated. The town where time stood still had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing beyond the natural boundaries of existence. Today, the valley where Millfield once stood remains empty, avoided by locals who can't quite explain why they feel uneasy when they pass through the area. Occasionally, hikers report strange sensations, moments where time seems to slow down or speed up inexplicably. Some claim to have seen glimpses of a town that isn't there. Phantom buildings that flicker in and out of existence like memories from a dream. The few surviving residents of Millfield have scattered across the country, most living under assumed identities provided by federal authorities. They've been monitored discreetly for decades, their unique temporal signatures making them valuable subjects for ongoing research into the nature of time itself. But they have also become living reminders of humanity's eternal struggle with forces beyond our comprehension. The story of Millfield serves as a chilling reminder that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, some boundaries too perilous to cross. Professor Whitmore's quest to conquer time ultimately revealed that time cannot be conquered, only respected. His legacy lives on in the empty valley where his town once stood, a monument to the price of defying the natural order. As for the Chronos engine itself, fragments of the device were recovered and studied by government scientists. But the technology remains largely incomprehensible. Some speculate that the professor's breakthrough was not entirely his own, that he may have been influenced by forces from outside our reality. Others believe that the knowledge was always there, waiting for someone ambitious enough or foolish enough to unlock its secrets. The truth may never be known. What we can say with certainty is that the strange town where time stood still has left an indelible mark on our understanding of reality itself. It reminds us that the universe is far stranger and more dangerous than we dare to imagine, and that some doors once opened can never be closed again. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly explorations into the darkest corners of history. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you, but remember that some questions are better left unanswered. The flow of time may seem constant and reliable, but as the people of Millfield learned, even the most fundamental aspects of reality can be more fragile than we ever imagined.